Welcome back to Veterans Forum, a program by veterans, about veterans, for veterans and their families. I'm your co-host, Bob West, with Ray Chattery and Jerry Devlin. Our goal is to provide you and your family with important information on legislation, programs, benefits, and support for you and your family by interviewing leaders in our community. Jerry, who do we have with us today?
We're really very fortunate tonight to have Delegate Marvin Holmes, who represents this district and has represented it since the 2002 election. And when Marvin got elected, he made a decision that he'd rather be a workhorse than a show horse. And he's been a steady, conscientious, hardworking member. And as a former legislator, I can tell you that he has two positions that really indicate both his character and the respect he's held in. One, he's chairman of the Ethics Committee in the House. Now, that's a committee that stands in judgment of your colleagues. And to be on that, you have to be a person who's above question yourself and have to make some really hard decisions, and in some cases about people you personally are fond of. Then he's also a member of the Administrative Executive Legislative Review Committee, which almost never appears in the papers. But they have the power in the off-season. They can declare any order of an agency, they can declare it violates the legislative intent and make it null and void. And in some cases it's suspensive, in some places it's final. But they don't put people on this who aren't taken seriously. And then of course he's on the Transportation Committee, which is headed by my good friend Kumar Barve, and he's chairman of the Housing and Real Property Subcommittee. So he's really in a quiet way, and I guess we need more people like that. Marvin Holmes is a very outstanding legislator, and we've been here in Bowie. We're very proud to have him representing us in the General Assembly.
Well, thank you very much for having me here today. I really appreciate it. I always enjoy going to the Veterans Memorial Ceremony on November the 11th. I've always attended, have always been there, and it's really good to see how many people, citizens come.
And I forgot to mention that Marvin is, of course, a veteran and served in the United States Coast Guard, and we know what kind of vital services they provide to this country. We're very proud of having two of our four legislators in this district are veterans, and that is very, very unique these days.
And we're very, very active on the Veterans Caucus in the General Assembly. The Veterans Caucus in the General Assembly meets very frequently during the session, and we vet and discuss all the legislation that's coming before us that deals with veterans and our causes as veterans. I'm very, very fortunate.
One of the benefits we have by having Delegate Holmes with us this evening is the fact that in addition to veterans issues, he's also involved with a number of issues that affect the general public. And being on the Housing Committee, he has a number of issues that are coming before the legislature this year, having to do with housing and foreclosures and bank liens and so forth. So let's get started with that and tell us what's happening with the banking industry and some of the changes that are coming forward.
Well, you know, there's been a lot of shifts in how foreclosures have taken place in Maryland since I became an elected official. In 2003, it took roughly about 15 to 20 days to go to foreclosure on a piece of property. The pendulum has swung, and now it's somewhere in the 300 to 400 day range. And some say that's too long, some say it's just right. But the problem that pendulum has caused is that we are having, and we are looking and we're seeing that there are a lot of houses in our neighborhoods, in our communities, that remain boarded up for a very, very long time. Part of that problem is that, interestingly enough, in the state of Maryland, which is 24 jurisdictions, the term or the definition of vacant and abandoned has 24 definitions. 24 definitions of the term vacant and abandoned, which sounds kind of odd, but that's the way it is at this particular point. So what I did was I took a piece of legislation that was signed by John Casey from Ohio, and I'm turning that into a Maryland bill that's going to be come out in 2017. And I'm making a definition for vacant and abandoned universal across the state. Now, what does that do? It allows each jurisdiction to be able to use a definition and a term so that they can get these houses out of the vacant and abandoned stage, get them back on the market. Second step of that is creating a land bank, which is another bill that I'm going to be putting forward. Creating a land bank so that we can strip off some of the liens from these vacant and abandoned houses. The counties, the cities, the jurisdictions can maintain those liens and go after the homeowners at a later point. But if we strip those liens off of the properties and make the properties more viable for sale for investors and other families, we can get those houses back into a good production and make these communities and families whole again. There's another one that I am going to be asking for banks to take title of these properties a lot earlier. There's been one particular case, a friend of mine who lived in the 23rd District, got a foreclosure notice, got a date of the foreclosure notice, the date of sale was postponed by the bank. She then moved out of state. 4 years later, after she had left the state, she got married and decided to buy a home, only to find out that the bank never took title of the property here in Maryland. So she couldn't go to closing on her other property that she had moved out of state to purchase. So one piece of legislation that I have is that the banks must notify when they postpone or abandon their ability to foreclose on a piece of property. It's just common sense to me, but there's a lot of things like that we have to balance in terms of how our housing market and our families in Prince George's County, and particularly in 23rd District, are done and are marketed and moving forward.
Well, that's good information, because I always wondered why some houses seem to be vacant for long periods of time before a for sale sign went up or anything happened at those properties. And now we're seeing some light as to why that happened. And of course, you don't pay too much attention to it unless it happens to you particularly.
And a lot of them get trashed
Yeah, they
and become an eyesore in the community.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's one term that has become very popular over the past decades since the housing market crashed in 2007, 2008. They're called zombie properties, because no one knows who owns them. If you call the bank says, we don't own it because we haven't taken title, and they're correct. You call the homeowner, and the homeowner says, well, the bank sent me a notice to go to foreclosure. They think that they don't own it, but they do. In the meantime, the county is responsible for, or sometimes picks up the tab for, cutting the grass and keeping the houses safe so that the vandals and derelicts, et cetera, don't move inside the houses and take them over. And all kinds of things can happen in an abandoned house. So a lot of this legislation that I have put forward from the interim study this past summer is geared towards making our communities whole again. As chair of the Housing and Real Property Subcommittee, we probably met almost every other week during the summer, which kind of puts a fallacy to we're only a 90-day session, if you know what I mean. I spent my entire summer in the General Assembly working on these issues for foreclosure and those kinds of things as chair of the Housing and Real Property Subcommittee. And I think you're going to see in the beginning of January 2017 some real legislation with some real teeth to try to help us in our communities to get these houses back on the market and put families back in these communities.
You had mentioned things about blighted and abandoned properties. What's the difference between a blighted and an abandoned property?
Good question. That's a very good question. And again, that goes back to the universal definition. If you ask someone in Harford County what vacant and abandoned is, and you ask someone in Prince George's County what vacant and abandoned is, there are two different definitions altogether. Vacant, if you, for example, you live in Bowie and you decide that during your summer months you want to go live in Florida, that's not an abandoned or vacant property. You have just decided that you're going to live 6 months in Florida. But if something happens where your lawn guy doesn't cut the grass, and then the county decides that, well, maybe this is vacant and abandoned, we have to establish some type of criteria that says it's vacant and abandoned. which doesn't necessarily mean it's vacant and abandoned because you're in Florida enjoying the sunshine. So that's how these definitions are important, so that we all universally understand what's taking place.
And
Yeah,
then we are, of course, a common law jurisdiction, and adverse possession means if a property's, nobody's there for 20 years and someone claims it as
Yes,
of right.
that's right.
Now, that's a long time.
Yeah.
Open, notorious, hostile is the definition. In other words, if you mowed your neighbor's lawn for 20 years,
yes,
and you claimed it as yours after 20 years, it is yours.
It is yours.
Called adverse possession.
That's right.
Wow.
Yes.
Maryland is a curious state that we have Article 5 of the Maryland Declaration of Rights says the citizens of Maryland are entitled to the common law, trial by jury in the common law, as it existed on July 4th, 1776. So any English law that's never been repealed is still good law. And every year the legislature, and the legislature has the power to, for example, battery used to be a common law offense, and the common law misdemeanors have no maximum sentence. Like you could sentence someone for any sentence that wasn't constitutionally cruel and unusual. And we have, in fact, one of my colleagues was a common law fan, prepared a criminal information for a woman we both knew, and charged her with being a common law scold. At the common law, this was a woman whose loud voice disturbed the neighborhood. And the penalty was the ducking stool. And that was still never been repealed.
It's interesting you should mention that. My first year as chair of the Housing and Real Property Subcommittee, I had to tackle the ground rent issue.
Ground rent, sure.
Ground rents. And it amazed me, and I learned all this as being chair of the Housing and Real Property Subcommittee. Ground rents were established, get this, in the summer of 1632.
Yeah, and they were, it meant that you could own the property, but you didn't own the land.
That's exactly right.
Like, for example, it's still good in England. The most valuable part of London, the West End, like where the American Embassy, I guess, in Grosvenor Square, I don't know if I think they're moving it. But anyway, the Duke of Westminster owns all of that land.
Yeah.
And despite the properties that are on it.
And even in the legislation that I crafted last year, I had to revise some terms in that ground rent legislation, because some of the terms in that ground rent legislation were referring to payment of ground rents in shillings, which we don't use anymore, obviously.
Yeah. Well, Maryland has so many of these old, for example, in 10 of the original 13 states had established religions. In other words, they were supported by taxation. In New England, it was a Congregationalist church. The only states that didn't were Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Rhode Island. The official church in Maryland was the Church of England. And of course, when the Declaration of Independence was promulgated, you couldn't have George III, the head of the church. So the Maryland General Assembly passed the Vestry Act and took all of the religious powers of the church and vested them in the governor. So recently, with the rank of Archbishop, Archbishop Glendenning was succeeded by Archbishop Hogan. And there's a church in D.C. which predates the American Revolution. They're still guided by the Vestry Act.
Well, it's amazing when you really get into it.
Well, we had for 10 years a Jewish governor who was also an Episcopal Archbishop.
Well, that's really something. Requiring property managers to be licensed.
This is a great one. In my professional life, I operate a property management company, and I truly believe that as a property manager, I should be licensed, just like real estate agents, architects, engineers, etc. Virginia is moving in that direction. D.C. has already has that. Property managers must be licensed. I'm going to try again for the second time in January 2017 to make property managers licensed. We need that. One of the requirements for being a licensed professional is education. And I think that if we force property managers to become licensed and get them to take continuing education classes, we won't have the same kind of problems that we have with a lot of property managers out here today.
And what are those problems that seem to have generated this interest?
Some property managers have really taken the monies that they were being paid, and they have just disappeared with the funds. Another problem with some of the property managers is that the laws that govern the boards of these management associations are not adhered to correctly. We need to have property managers understanding totally what their responsibilities are, and the weight of the law should force them to understand the property management profession.
You know, one of the things, and this goes with a number of other kinds of issues where you have turned over something of yours to be managed by someone else. And I've seen this especially with payroll processing. When you hire a payroll company to do the work for you, a number of payroll companies would inform the IRS and the state comptroller not to send that individual any kind of notices and so forth. It goes to the payroll company that's doing the processing. And that is an issue, because what happens, and it happened to a number of my clients that had been using a professional payroll company, was their payroll taxes weren't getting paid.
Right.
And the payroll company kept the money, and
Yes.
you know, after a few years, absconded with a lot of money.
Yeah.
And my suggestion would be that they wouldn't be able to stop the state government or whatever that's sending information about that property only to the property management company, that those notices also have to go to the property owner also.
Yes, yeah, and part of the legislation that I'm putting together does in fact have multiple notifications involved with it. Not only the property owner, but also State Department of Assessment and Taxation is going to be part of this legislation, as well as DOLR, Department of Labor Licensing and Regulation. So there's going to be some cross checks in some state agencies.
They're actually going to share information?
We're going to try. We're going to try.
Well, if that works, I have another suggestion too. So, because I've been working on something for a long time on that. Wow, hope springs eternal.
Yes, indeed.
There always is a veterans issue that comes up on a regular basis, and it has to do with military retirement pay.
Yes, indeed.
And I'm sure there'll be some legislation coming up again.
Yes.
It's been moving forward in $5,000 increments.
That's correct.
It's up to $10,000 if you're 65 and older.
Yes.
If you're under 65, it's still $5,000.
Yeah.
The governor said that he was willing to open it up to full retirement, whatever that was. And so where do you think the winds are blowing for this coming year?
Well, you're correct in that this legislation has moved forward in $5,000 increments. I believe the first time it was $2,500 in 2006.
When Bob Ehrlich was governor. Yeah.
Right, in 2006, and then went from 2,500 to 5,000, and now in 2015 it went to 10,000. So there is a slight movement. I'm hopeful that not only can we move it up to 15,000, but maybe perhaps remove the 65 age requirement as well. Again, we have to take into consideration what this means fiscally, because every time you make these kind of adjustments, that money has to come from somewhere. It's just like when the governor reduced the monies to cross the bridge. It's a great idea in terms of reducing the money out of the pockets of the consumers. The downside to that was now we have a transportation budget which is no longer funded properly to fund our roads and our bridges. So there's two parts of every equation. So in order for us to move that $5,000 bar up, we need to figure out where that money is going to be coming from, so we make sure we can fully fund it.
Yeah, that's where many people in our viewing audience, they're used to Congress. Of the 50 states, 49 states have balanced budget requirements. And Vermont is the exception, by the way. And it means, as Marvin says, if you take away from, unless you have growth, when you have a year when the federal economy is healthy, the state is a beneficiary, and you can do some things. But otherwise, it's going to, if I'm going to lower your taxes, I'm going to raise his.
That's right, right. And that goes right back to when Barack Obama first became president and we were in a recessionary time period. The federal government gave Maryland, for a couple of years, 3 or 4 years, I think, some monies to help us out because our coffers were just about bare. And we used that money for pensions and roads, et cetera. But then that money dried up. And we, as a state legislature, had to figure out how to take care of where those funds were going to be coming from. We do have to have a balanced budget every year, and it does present some challenges sometimes. Maryland is a little bit different than most states in that the governor has the lion's share of the responsibility in terms of the budget. The governor sends the General Assembly legislatures the budget each year, and it goes back and forth between which chamber addresses the budget first. One year, the governor sends the budget and the Senate has it first. The next year, the governor sends the budget out and the House has it first. And then we have to balance between the needs of the state. Now, the governor's budget, when it comes out, the legislatures, the House and the Senate, we can't take money from one pile and put it in another pile. The only thing that we can do as legislators do is cut the governor's budget. So
with one little exception. It's constitutional if you have a new spending bill, but you have to have in the bill a revenue-raising device.
That's right. To fund that.
Yeah,
to fund that.
yeah.
That's exactly correct.
And it's politically, it's why Maryland, which has a Republican governor and an overwhelmingly Democratic legislature. Now, in Massachusetts, had the same thing when Mitt Romney was governor. Well, if a governor can't, in Massachusetts, get enough votes to sustain a veto, he ceases to be governor. Like Mitt Romney in his 4 years vetoed 800 bills, and the Massachusetts legislature overrode 750 of them. But you can't make the governor in Maryland irrelevant because he controls the budget. He has to be dealt with.
That's right.
And that's kind of unique.
Yeah,
and it's one of the many reasons why Maryland is one of 5 states in the union with a AAA bond rating.
That's right.
I mean, the bonding houses in New York think we're a pretty solvent state. We're very well run, you know.
Well, it's good to be next to the federal government, too.
Now, one thing, Marvin, is especially on the borders, like up in Pennsylvania, Maryland border, or the Pennsylvania-Delaware border, or down near Virginia, has there really been a study of how many retireds actually left the state because of getting a better tax break somewhere else?
I'm sure that there has been. I do know that at one point when I was on a housing committee, I was chair of one of the subcommittees on the housing committee that was put forth by Governor Ehrlich. There were a lot of discussions about citizens from Maryland leaving the state altogether because of retirement funding, et cetera. But I haven't seen any studies as of late. I'm sure that there are some. I just have not seen any as of late.
Maryland's also an in-migrant state. For example, when I was in the legislature, 60% of the legislators were born in another state. And people come to Maryland for a while and leave. But Marylanders tend to stay. And the ones that leave, you don't go to Florida necessarily because of the tax situation. Right. Like today in Naples, Florida, it was 85 degrees. You know, this show is being broadcast in December, being televised in December. You know that I don't. You know, and what you do is we were talking before we went on the air. If you move to Virginia, you pay a personal property tax on your house. You don't pay that in Maryland. If you go to Delaware, well, they fake it. They pretend not to have a sales tax, but they really do. They have a 2% gross tax, receipts tax, so they really do. But they pay higher income tax.
Basically, if you looked at it, there's not too much tax advantage moving from one state to the other.
No. Some way it catches you, sure.
Yeah. There's one way, like Florida has huge property taxes down there. Yeah. They don't have income tax, but you know, one way or the other,
big sales tax.
They're going to get you.
They're going to get you.
Yeah.
But you have to look at your own individual situation. Right. And a lot of people, like you said, most of us are foreigners from another state who came here to work, and when we retire, you know, a lot of people just go back home. You know, where they're originally from.
As a native Bostonian, I go back and forth all the time between here and Boston, and I always set my gas gauge so I can get gas just after you get off the Delaware Memorial Bridge.
Oh, and the Jersey Turnpike?
No, beside the Jersey Turnpike,
Oh.
there's another road. Gasoline was about 25. It was about 25 cents a gallon cheaper. I mean, such gigantic. And it's illegal to have self-serve gas. They have an attendant does it.
Yeah.
And then yesterday I told my son-in-law to come and we could get the gas, and I discovered the gas was just as expensive as Massachusetts. And when you have troubles, they come everywhere. I asked the girl pumping the gas, I said, gee, gas used to be so much cheaper. And she said, it's our governor, Chris Christie. It's like what I learned going to New England. 60 years I've been going back and forth, and I've been going across the George Washington Bridge. I never knew you had to work to screw up traffic up there. I just thought that, regardless of who was the governor.
It's kind of the same thing with me. I'm born and raised in Cleveland, and when my first duty station in the military was with the Presidential Honor Guard. So I was going back and forth between here and Cleveland frequently. Now my mom is still in Cleveland. I'm still going back and forth between here and Cleveland. But I don't think I'll go back to Cleveland.
Yeah, no.
Before we run out of time, Marvin, you're in the Veterans Caucus.
Yes.
I have a real problem with one item. Is there any way we can get the schools in Maryland not to have school on Veterans Day? Because if it wasn't for the private schools in Bowie, we'd have no kids at the Veterans Day program in Bowie. And we have a very, very active, as you know.
It's even worse, Ray. My grandchildren go to Holy Trinity, which is a private school. They follow the Prince George's calendar, the public school calendar.
Well,
But I mean, like you said, there's 24 departments of education. There's some way, somewhere in Maryland, they have to get everything together.
Yeah.
Like there's 24 health departments, there's
That's
24
right. That's
liquor
right.
boards.
That's right.
There's 24 departments of education. There's 24 of everything.
Yes, there are.
And
There are.
none of them operate the same way.
Yeah.
And it's like a state within a state.
I think that every now and then there is a move that shakes things up, particularly in something like this. And as we all know, the governor declared that schools are supposed to start now after Labor Day. That makes every jurisdiction adjust their timeframes for the school year. And some are having some real difficulties in doing so.
I know where they can save about 8 days, get rid of that in-service they used to have, that they have. They never had it in Pennsylvania.
I see.
Well, now we started with veterans and we're ending up with children's education, so you never know what's happening. We certainly want to thank Delegate Marvin Holmes once again for being our guest and enlightening us about legislation, and it really is making sausage. So we want to thank you once again for watching Veterans Forum, and we'd like to get you involved by stopping by the American Legion or the DAV. Find out about the benefits that you have earned. Find out what's happening to families like yours in the community, how we can help. So once again, Happy New Year, and thank you again for watching Veterans Forum.